Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn. And I'd like to thank Charlie for inviting me to interview him. He's putting his life in my hands, so I hope that that will be successful. We're going to talk for about half an hour. We'll stick to time, but we would like to offer the opportunity to for anyone to ask any questions, and if you could put those in the chat, I will look at them when we've finished the interview, not as we go along. So if we could go on that basis.
Barbara, can I just make a continuity announcement for your sake? Craig Cathcart has kindly offered to moderate the questions so that you don't have to worry about that.
Okay.
So he'll come in at that point.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So most of us know Charlie, but those of us, some of us won't. And there are also those of us who know some things about Charlie, but not everything. And so I'd like to start with just a bit of orientation around Charlie. Charlie is a senior teaching fellow at the University of Strathclyde, and he is course leader on the university's LLM MSc in Mediation Conflict Resolution. And that's been since 2009. Charlie is a mediator, supervisor, published author, and he's also director and supervisor of the university's mediation clinic, which since 2011 has offered free mediation to the sheriff's courts across Scotland, and that involves students on the course. So I don't know if I've left anything out, Charlie, but
enough for now.
Okay, so focusing today on reflective practice, I thought it might be an opportunity to talk around a bit of the background, Charlie, of how you got into mediation in the first place and then became the course leader and the supervising director, and the role of reflective practice. So quite a lot there, but just a snapshot, really.
How I got into mediation is a strange one. When I was doing a law degree in the middle of the last century, I quite quickly worked out that I wasn't particularly drawn to some of what the lawyers call black letter law, I guess. In fact, lawyering, I was already working out that I wasn't relishing that very much. And I listened to the radio one day, I think about 1981, and I heard somebody from Bristol talking about a thing called family conciliation, which I'd never heard of. But as they explained it, I think a penny dropped somewhere in my head and stayed there for 12 years. I mean, I often had another career and attempted to be a professional musician for a while and gave up the law completely. And then somewhat later in my 30s, I thought it was time to think about, might there be a career outside music? And I just arrived back in Glasgow, and this is really old fashioned. I literally got the phone book and looked up family conciliation and phoned the number. And I got a nice man called Walter, who became my boss. He invited me in for an interview, offered training. At that time, they paid for it. So there must have been something in my head that said, this would be a good thing for me.
So the course you teach on started in 2009. You lead on that, and that's still running every year. And there'll be an opportunity for anyone who is interested. There'll be an opportunity with Stuart Kubra at lunchtime to discuss the possibility of signing up and what that involves. So I won't go too much into that because Stuart will be going with that. But if we think about the role of reflective practice in the course.
Well, I maybe just to continue that story slightly. So once I started practicing, I was given a supervisor, and the woman I had was actually a psychotherapist by training who'd become a mediator. And again, there are some penny drop moments. So this was verbal. At that time, we were asked to write, actually, but that wasn't a huge part of this. We generally talked about our cases. And I just remember having one discussion with Anne and telling her what had happened. And she said to me, "That's a really great story, but you were completely invisible. What did you do?" And that was another of these penny drop moments, I think, for a new mediator. At the beginning, you're just so terrified. I mean, you're just constantly thinking, how do I not screw this up? And what on earth do I say next? And for somebody to start allowing you to articulate, well, I did make a choice there, and I did decide that. As I say, that stuck with me actually for a while. And the second thing from that family mediation time was I shared a room with somebody who was quite chatty, and she and I used to just talk over cases. So I think I've been shaped and formed by, it's not just the doing, actually the talking about it and the thinking about it is a huge part of what makes you ready for anything, because anything can happen. And anyone who's ever done family mediation will be conscious, but all forms of mediation have that potential, I think, to go in directions that you did not plan or choose. And so I think that reflective stuff, it helped me as time went on.
Can you say a little around the setting up of the clinic, how that came about?
Sure. So after I started the masters, that took a while. I had to persuade the university that there would be not only a demand for it, but I remember one law academic saying, "Mediation, a whole master's, is there enough in it?" The cheek of her, who taught contract law. Anyway, that took a wee while, and then the first students came. I think some of them are on this call, at least one is. And I remember those students saying, "Role play, that's fine. That's quite scary and quite interesting, but it would be so much better if we could get involved in real cases." And around about the same time, I met people from America who had brought students to this country to take part in something called a mediation competition. And their students won. These students were miles better than anyone else in the competition, quite apart from being Californian and having the best teeth. They were also the best mediators, and they clearly been around the block. And he explained to me that there was a clinic, they were running this thing called a mediation clinic. So I put two and two together. I thought, well, if they can do it there, we can do it here. So that, it was really student demand, actually, to be fair. Right. They said, and then I thought, well, that's what we call it.
Right. So the setting up, that was done, did you have funding or did you just?
No, I mean, it was slow, very slow going at first. We began, and this will be a lesson for anyone who's thinking of starting a mediation clinic. Before we got involved with the courts, which actually didn't come until 2014, we were trying to persuade the law school's law clinic to refer cases for mediation. And I remember we did lots of training, we had lots of meetings, and lots of the people in the law clinic, which is a big law clinic, expressed interest and fascination. And yet they hardly referred any cases. And it was quite a telling lesson that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And particularly to young lawyers who are just learning the art of litigation, they would say mediation is a great idea, but not for this case, because this case needs to go to court. So we had very, very few. It was only when we began to, we had the stroke of luck, and a sheriff, one of our judges, came to a formal launch and said, "Could you help? Do you think you could help with my small claims?"
Wow.
I think we could.
So that was 2011. So did you, right from the beginning, apply reflective practice as a super? Because you've been supervisor throughout, as well as director.
Formal. No, I would actually need to ask. I think Andrew Boyd's on the call. I can maybe ask him. I don't think so. I don't think we had a formal the mediator reflection form as a review form as it currently is. Initially, it was very much, it grew out of the course. So the expectation was these would be either immediate students or students who just graduated would still be in the way of writing about their work, thinking about it, because it's also part of the course to write reflectively. And also in the early days, there's so few cases, we chewed them over endlessly. We had lots of time to talk. So I think it was largely talk-based, Barbara, at the beginning.
But it's moved into being a central element of the clinic now, and
a key element. I was also, I mean, I must acknowledge another source. I stole or borrowed the review form that I think was originally devised for the Edinburgh Sheriff Court project, which has been on the go. There's a Sheriff Court mediation project since about 1999. And the woman who founded that then brought that into another context where I'm on a mediation panel for dealing with complaints against lawyers, actually. And so in that context, you don't get paid until you return your review form, which is a cunning model. And so I was in the habit, as Lynn already said, you know, there's something about having to do it straight away. You're very grateful 6 months later, or even a week later. You really could do without it at the time.
Yeah. So just thinking around things as they are now, what would you say are some of the advantages of using reflective practice?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. It's difficult not to relate this to one's own practice. Maybe I need to go through 2 or 3. So starting with the individual mediator, on a positive level, I think we often fail to notice the things that we did well. And I mean, we're variable in that. There's a bit of a spectrum of humanity where some people appear to notice everything they did well and not much that they did wrong. But a lot of people do dwell much more on things they could have done better than on the things that went well. And yet, for me, capturing the good moves, the little pieces of chance that worked, and remembering them is as important as what you did wrong. So I think that's one dimension of it. It's simply sifting, digesting, chewing over your own practice with a view to every case applies a corrective, doesn't it? And when you've done 10, you have a number of correctives. And when you've done 100, you've more correctives to your practice. But by the time you've done 100, you've forgotten numbers 1 to 10. So I think there's another benefit to these written forms, that they do give us some kind of a way of tracing our thinking.
Yeah.
So that's what you asked a slightly bigger question, I think, about what else is in it. I think I would recognize there is also something about the courts. The courts seem to expect that we will be professional, but they've never ever asked. Okay, they've never said, what's the quality assurance? They have assumed, I think now on the basis of practice, but they've taken that for granted, I think, because it comes from university, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure, but that won't go on forever. And inevitably, sooner or later, the justice system is going to be asking, particularly if the justice system starts to fund what we do, which I have my fingers crossed about quite strongly in Scotland, and that's looking more positive. They're going to ask the question, how do we know that what you do is a quality thing? And I think that very much chimes with my view of what makes our practitioner that parties will trust. And I think so there's a contract, isn't there, with any professionals? The contract is we charge quite a lot of money, but in return for that, we do quite a lot of work, some of which you don't see, not just when we're with you, to ensure that what you're getting from us is of a certain standard. So for me, it contributes to that professional concept.
Mm. Just on a point, when you in your role as a supervisor and using reflective practice in that role, do you see people individually, or do you have group meetings, or do you do both?
In the clinic, we've not had the resources or luxury to do individual supervision very much. Occasionally, it's an ad hoc, and that's something I'd like to work on, perhaps. So it's been peer supervision, group supervision led by an experienced mediator has been a common model. So I should just say that someone alerted me recently to the word supervision carries very different baggage in different contexts.
Yeah.
And coming like you, Barbara, from a family mediation background, for me, it had quite benign connotations. My supervisors were delightful people who were very much interested in helping me to improve my practice. But in some contexts, the word supervision implies there's someone who checks up on you and tells you off if you're not doing it right, and has the potential to end your practice. So I use the word slightly cautiously these days, and maybe it needs to be explained. And again, reflective practice probably it's much further, it's much deeper than that. It's placing most of the responsibility on the practitioner.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. What would you say are the challenges that you have bringing reflective practice into the civil justice system, and also people who have a legal background where it may be a completely new concept to them when they become mediators, and so forth?
Yes, I mean, Barbara, you and I have both had some involvement in what would you call it, the mediation wars of the early 2000s, when that happened in England and Wales, and there was a bit of a clash of cultures between those with a legal background and those with a psychology background. In Scotland, that hasn't been as pronounced, but well, what makes me chuckle, every year I do have an involvement with undergraduate law students as well. Well, not so much now, but we have a module on the postgraduate diploma in legal practice, which is what you have to do in Scotland to become a lawyer. And there's an elective in mediation. And I think this year 90 people are taking it out of a cohort of 140. So really significant numbers of the future lawyers have got a module which includes mediation practice. And they're asked to do a reflective journal as one of their assignments. And every year it flummoxes a certain proportion of law students who find it a very, very taxing concept, having just mastered essay writing. And then somebody's asking me to write about me, but I thought I wasn't allowed. I thought it wasn't allowed. B, I thought I wasn't supposed to write in the first person. C, what do I say? You mean I don't look in a book? So I think culturally, I mean, that would not be unique to law. That's probably, there are quite a number of professions for whom it's just not a tradition. And so I recognize one wants to be quite gentle with people and sell it to them. I suppose I'm trying to sell it to you, who come from different traditions.
Yeah. Yes, it's been quite an issue in medical practice, in nursing and so forth. There have been a lot of complaints about reflection, although it's very embedded. Yeah.
Yes, and there's something actually, there is quite an important point I want to make. I think if you think somebody is going to read your reflection, that may have a positive dimension because it makes you feel validated. But, and I'm about to adjust things slightly in the mediation clinic, I think if you write it for the reader as if you're being scrutinized and held to account, it becomes a different thing. you know, we all know how to jump through hoops. If you present me with a series of criteria against which I'll be measured, I'll regurgitate them back to you. And so I'm actually going to, I've developed the practice. I added a box on the form for the director's comments, and I'm actually going to take that back off. I will continue to read them, and I will make general comments. We've also become bigger. It's become very difficult for me to make comments on every single reflection. But I think it's more about the meaning, that these are intended to enable individual practitioners to float their own thinking and not to jump through hoops. It's not a device in our model for holding people to account. There are other ways of holding people to account, I think.
If I could ask you a bit about ethics, because mediation has a lot of ethical debates as well. I wondered what your thoughts were on the ethics of reflective practice.
I've been influenced by two North American writers. I don't know what order they came in, but the first probably was Julie McFarlane, who wrote an article called The Limits of Mediating Ethically and the Limits of Codes of Conduct and the Potential of a Reflective Practice. And she basically makes the point that rules for mediation, such as they are, struggle to reflect the complexity of what's going on in the room. And she, in fact, I think I'll just read this. I was just reading it before. She says, the reality of mediation is that ethical judgment making occurs constantly, intuitively, and often unconsciously. And that resonates with me, that there's so many moments in a mediation where you go this way or that way, and they've got ethical implications, that it's very difficult to say, there is a rule and I followed it today. I'm not knocking. I think the codes of practice that we have and the broad general principles, they have to be there and they should be there. But the application of them requires a much, much more complex range of practice in a way that doesn't quite translate into some other. I mean, a lot of activities are complex, but mediation's got a particular complexity because of these riding two horses at once. You know, the action between the parties is out of our control. So I think that influenced me. And a woman called Sarah Cobb, who's such an astonishing writer, and she wrote an article called Einsteinian Practice and Newtonian Discourse. It was the crisis in mediation ethics, actually. Einsteinian practice and the Newtonian discourse. So what she's really saying is, rules such as they are like Newtonian physics. They're correct and they're accurate, and they measure the world and they give you fairly good predictions of what's going to happen. But in an Einsteinian universe, we know that things are also affected by the observer, and that's really what she's getting at, the recognition that the mediator is equally an observer of the action and of themselves and a player. She's having a bit of a pop at neutrality, but I think all of that has influenced my thinking about this, that we need to be continually reflective, and we need to take seriously the range of options we have in every moment.
When it comes to supervision in a group and sharing in a reflective practice group, do you have any thoughts about that in terms of ethics?
In terms of ethics, I have not framed those in my own mind as occasions for holding people to account. I think there can be some dimensions of sharing of good practice, so that there's certainly a sense of some people in those groups will be closer to the beginning of their career, might find themselves in the role of learners and will pick things up. But at the same time, to me, the richest moments in those groups, and I still take part in groups like that, is when practitioners are helped to think more deeply about their own practice by the group. So I think the role of the group is actually not to tell people off and not to say, I wouldn't have done that, I'd have done this. I think the role of the group is to ask the sort of questions well-intentioned fellow practitioners would ask. So I think that requires some facilitation.
Yes. And clearly, the mediation is a confidential process that we go to great lengths to guard the confidentiality of it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's anything about sharing, identifying, or potentially identifying features when you talk in a group, because you don't know who else knows enough. You can't know that, and it's possible to do it. Have you got any thoughts about protecting the confidentiality of the group?
I think we should. I mean, I agree with you. I think that's an issue. When you're doing small claims across now quite a large area, I guess once you take away the names, and we certainly take away the names, then the risks are lower. But absolutely, I think in our written work, especially with me discovering just how far-reaching GDPR may have to be, I think our reflections, and here's an issue I'd be interested in lawyers on the call, if they have any thoughts, but my view is that my notes to me are mine. I don't put anybody's name on them. I put no case identifying feature, and therefore I don't regard that as something that somebody could come and ask for. Mm-hmm. I hope I'm not deluded in that, because I would write very differently, of course. Yeah. If I thought that this could be, used in some future way. Yeah. But the review forms, I think we've got to be quite cautious these days.
In case there's someone on the call who doesn't know what GDPR is, could you just say that?
Oh goodness, General Data Protection Regulations, I think. Yeah.
Another acronym.
Yeah.
Okay, so just moving towards the end, talking about opportunities and where this is, maybe you see it going, and anything new on the horizon.
That's a good question. I think we probably will need to move. Well, two things maybe. One is about the ethical foundation for mediation. As we've kind of acknowledged, the codes of practice, the Scottish Mediation's code of practice is pretty minimal, and it's all essential. There's no conflict of interest. You're committed to impartiality and so on. But I'm quite impressed by the counselling profession, whose approach to ethics has got 2 or 3 different components, but one of them is pretty much Aristotelian. They're essentially named a series of, they don't call them virtues, do they? I think they call them principles. I think there are 6 principles that govern ethical counselling. And they recognize that there may be occasions when one of those principles comes into conflict with another. And they recognize that the individual practitioner will have a duty to apply their own judgment in doing that. So there's a part of me is quite drawn to that and think mediation should look at something like that. Whether we'll have the choice might depend on legislation and so on. So that, I think that's probably where I'm going. In terms of the clinic and reflective practice, maybe it's time for us to have more individual supervision and support for practitioners, and it's a resource matter. If we, ideally, I benefited hugely from that, and I think others would, and so that's on my horizon. Not quite sure. I'm reliant on incredible amounts of time and energy from volunteers at the moment, for which massive gratitude.
What sort of cases are you, is it all small claims, or are you involved with other cases?
it's nearly all, we do have the odd self-referral, some housing matters, but most of the, I think we had 250 referrals from the courts last year and another 20 were self-referrals. So that gives you some idea. And yeah, they're anything up to £5,000 in the civil arena. Building disputes, contracts, people owing each other money, second-hand cars is a great favourite. Sometimes we have some neighbours. We seem to me to have quite a lot of builders and disputes over construction and so on.
Mm. Yeah.
I think it's like mini commercial mediation. Right. It's a commercial mediation for smaller amounts of money.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So we've got Stuart hosting a session on the course at lunchtime, as I've mentioned, but if someone were interested in setting up a clinic, would you be willing to talk to them about that? They got in touch with you? Yeah.
I did after last year's conference. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's a resource. And I'm aware of the time, but before I hand over to the Q&A, is there anything that I should have asked you and didn't?
I mean, I do have a tendency to waffle on, so no, that probably was about right.
Okay. So, is Craig?
Yes, Craig, I think is
taking
coming on. I don't know if Pauline can add him.
I'm right here, folks. Thank you very much for that discussion. So far in the chat box, we've had more commentary than actual questions to either of you. We've had some recognition of the cultural pushback that one can get if one is trying to introduce reflection into a domain where it's not been part of the professional practice. We've had some nods again on the ethical issues around confidentiality, and particularly in the group context as well, and you know, recognizing the benefits that Charlie has articulated very well, both individually and in terms of quality assurance of any particular mediation scheme or project. But nonetheless, you know, how does one address the possible ethical issues that might arise, particularly in that group context? And that might be a good place to start our reflections on what's come up in the chat box.
Would you like me to respond to that, Craig? Is that?
Yeah, I think so, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. I think it's always tricky when things haven't been problematic. I mean, maybe that's my approach is somewhat reactive, and therefore to date I've not been conscious specifically on the issue of confidentiality of people placing themselves at risk, or me for that matter at risk. You're making me think perhaps we would do well to put in writing some principles for reflection, and that's an interest, and I'd be curious if anybody on the call has come across that. But some ethical principles, particularly in terms of protecting the identity of the folk involved. I'm sometimes shocked at how fast and loose other professions are talking about their clients. Lawyers, I think, get careless because some matters are in the public domain in court. I'm sorry, I'm sounding a bit harsh on lawyers. And therefore, because it's in the court, it's in the public domain, so I can use people's names. But I'm not sure that necessarily is consistently applied, you know, to private matters that are not in the court yet. Social workers have sometimes come on to me when I was a family mediator, using people's names and all sorts. So I don't know that we're doing that badly. We are pretty careful. I don't hear people in the meetings that I've been in using people's names. I think that habit of party A, party B, perhaps we should be more careful and not say it was in Paisley, or you know, we have actually to date, we would say this was a Falkirk case. That's a thought. But yes, I've not got great alarm bells at the moment about that issue.
Thank you very much for that. And in the chat box, Graham has suggested that there may be an example of appropriate recording of cases given by the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman. Obviously, part of their thing is to be publicly accountable, but to do so in a way that protects individuals that may have been involved in their cases. So maybe that's a source that we could learn from in terms of accounting and reporting. There was a comment earlier on in the chat box as well about reflective writing. And you alluded yourself about the different purposes that this might have. It could be about making oneself accountable, but also, and perhaps one might say, the greater purpose of is to gain self-knowledge and self-insight. But one might write differently, as you said yourself, depending on who the audience is. Do you want to just sort of tell us a wee bit more about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, that is something that it would have been good to say a bit more about. So I think I'm a great believer in a good form. So the right form will, to some extent, bring out the right result. And so I would acknowledge that the form that the clinic uses has been adopted as a bit of a halfway house. It's quite factual. It's called a review form. It's not called a reflection form. It has some space for reflection, and some people use it for that. Some people use it in a more minimal fashion. So that was inherited, as I say, and it fulfills a function. It can be done relatively quickly. I use other forms, and this should have been part of my story. I think that when I did a master's in London at Birkbeck College, one of the first things we were given, I think the very first day, we were given Michael Lang, who's speaking at 12 o'clock, the book he co-wrote with Alison Taylor. We were given their, now what's it called? It's called a post-session inventory. And when it was new to me, and I was a practicing family mediator, I delved into it. Now it's much, much more thorough and much more in depth. I would say it probably takes me 2 hours realistically to do, if I follow that fully, you know, and answer the questions with a degree of detail. So I've come across another one since then from a guy called Gary Friedman, who's a very famous Californian mediator. Him and John Landy produced one, and that's maybe a bit of a halfway house. So maybe there's something there. I haven't thought about this. This is for my own practice. Students will have certainly had the post-session inventory. Whether anybody uses it or not, I've never, you know, I don't check, but it might be a thought, mightn't it, to make available to people more than one instrument for their own reflection. Alongside that, I think the factual review form, there are components of that that we need to have for the sake of running a service. But I think it's good to go further. Yeah, so actually I'm putting the blame somewhat on myself. I think the form will govern what you write to a large extent.
Thanks very much for that, Charlie. Barbara, anything from you on what you've been hearing? I think you're muted, Barbara.
I always manage to do it once. Thank you for the answers. That's great. I wanted to come back to the whole word supervision, because we've been around that down here in the UK, where...
We're in the UK, Barbara.
I know. England and Wales, different jurisdiction. When mediation started, it was very much influenced, as you've said, by family mediation and supervision, clinical supervision. And when initially it was a mixture of people like social workers and therapists and lawyers who trained. But when lawyers really came on board, which was after the family therapists, they didn't like the word supervisor particularly, because of exactly because of the connotations that you have mentioned. So now, if you're a supervisor, you, in family work at least, you are a professional practice consultant. So shortened to PPC. And so that is the way around it. And I like it. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I think it gets away from the idea of being told off and critiques and just negativity, really. It's more about consultancy. So that's the model. Now it's the same work basically, but it's the same accountability. It's just got a different label.
Thanks very much. Just looking back to the chat box, I'm told that apparently one of the master's students in last year actually chose reflective practice as his or her topic. So there may be some research that's out there that if they are willing to share, that we could all benefit from. Charlie, any insights into that?
Yeah, I'll try and hastily trying to remember because I certainly marked it. I think I need to. They put me on the spot now.
Well,
I think like Barbara, it's fair to say some critical ideas have also been raised. You know, is it what it's cracked up to be? And I suppose maybe the biggest one, the cynic's critique would say, well, if you place all the responsibility on the practitioner, you don't take account of the rogue practitioner who'll just jump through any hoops you give them. And I think that's an absolutely fair cop.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to say that, and in terms of the clinic, the mediators are coming from a background of doing an LLM stroke MSc. And so they're grounded in theory. This isn't just everyone has theories about practice, but this is based on the studies and the training they will do on the course of empirical work. And I think that grounds you differently from just coming with your existing theories of practice.
Do you mind if I add to that, Craig, that I should just say though, as time goes on, because the clinic has grown and expanded, we've welcomed some others from outside, you know, who've not done the master's program. And that's been good. You know, I think that's been an enriching bringing together of different traditions. But I recognize what you say. I think the academic approach maybe I have taken for granted. You need to think about that.
Thank you. I should say that Michael, our keynote, has commented approvingly of the topics that we've been discussing in this opening session, saying the fact that we are concerned with ethics and ethical issues shows that we're thinking along the right lines and we're being mindful of honouring the privacy and confidentiality of the parties. So thank you for that note of approval from you, Michael. So we've talked about individual reflection. We've talked about the possibility of reflecting in a group context. Of course, many of us will be used to schemes of co-mediation, and someone's commented about the usefulness of a sort of combined reflective exercise with a kind of peer review exercise. If one has a kind of a joint wash up at the end of co-mediation. Any thoughts or insights you want to share on co-mediation and the post-session wash up that you might do with your co-mediator?
I mean, from my point of view, it's been fantastic, you know, and again, huge gratitude to people who are volunteers out of their own time, are largely so fascinated by the work, you know, that they want to sit around and talk it through at the end of the cases. I don't take that for granted. I realize that that's time, you know, and as we get busier, that might become more challenging, and maybe that needs to be built in a more formalized way. But they're absolutely right. There's something about if you've been in it together, that's a different relationship, isn't it? Yeah. You know, it's like you've just been through some kind of major event you know, to like when people in a football team come off and they've got a lot to say. I think there's a downloading that in the moment is incredibly useful, and you sometimes get some slivers of insight that you're only getting because you're doing it in the moment. So for me, it's a both and. I hope that's going on a lot.
Barbara, anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree with you. I think I was trained initially only ever to co-work. We were not allowed to work on our own when I started. And then that became sole mediation, and the co-work is now an exception. There's logistical issues about diaries and, you know, all the rest of it, and having enough time to debrief properly. So I think it's a intensive model. I think it's very valuable and it's the ideal, but I don't think it's necessarily practical all the time. And it's just how do we manage that? But I agree. I've had a lot of very valuable insights from working with other people.
Thank you both very much. I'm conscious of time. I'm sure Lynn or someone will keep us right, but I think we've just got a few minutes left. Let me just quickly review some of the comments that are coming in. Yeah, comments that, you know, there is the idea of going through the formal process of reflection, but it is one actually absorbing the lessons, I suppose. And, you know, this is, you know, mediators, you know, need to be individually committed to the benefits of reflection rather than just going through the motions of it, I suppose. Comment from Gordon that, you know, models of supervision, much as we're mindful of the, you know, the hopefully very rare rogue that Charlie refers to there, you know, we should be careful not to build our models and philosophies of supervision around it, because it then becomes about control and regulation rather than about support and development. So and that maybe echoes back to what Charlie was thinking about the counselling profession and the Aristotelian principles. Again, from Michael, said that, you know, we have to acknowledge that actually, you know, there is reflective practice and reflective supervision you know, there is, for people who are just starting out, for all of us perhaps, there is sometimes the need to be corrective. You know, we do need to, you know, we make errors, we need to learn from them as well. Sometimes they need to be pointed out to us as well. So, you know, we need to acknowledge that is part of the purpose of the whole reflective process. And then a practical suggestion from Victoria that is there scope, suitably arranged, of course, is there scope for videoing our own mediation so that we can see ourselves as others see us? Is that something? Maybe we'll start with that. Any thoughts on that as a practical way of actually literally seeing oneself?
It can be done. It requires clients to say yes, and in the small claims context that we're operating in, that might be a bit of a hassle. So it's not been done. However, I wouldn't rule it out at all. I know counsellors quite often ask a client, and they'll find one. Doctors have to do this as well. So sure, why not? And whenever I've done it, I have done it on one or two occasions, mostly role plays. I mean, it makes it's cringing, but fantastic in a kind of ghastly way, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And Lynn's telling me through the chat that Tom has his hand up. Tom, you want to say something?
Well, I put it up and took it down. I was just going to say that doctors in the past, well, especially in general practice, have a video drill consultations, and it's part of the training process. The trainer will reflect on the consultation with the trainee, him trying to reflect on the good points and bad points, critical points in a consultation, points he's missed, and the trainer will reflect on his reflections. And when they're training trainers, they have small groups where each trainer will show his own consultation and reflect on it, then the others will reflect on it. So that has to be supervised very carefully. You have to have trained facilitators for that. It can be good or it can be a dangerous process.
Thanks very much, Tom. I won't ask Charlie and Barbara to come back on that. I'm just conscious of time, but I think learning from other professions, I think, is very, very useful. So thank you very much for that insight. Just to wind up then, final look at the comments. So apparently literature tells us that collective reflective practice can be more effective than individual in many contexts. So again, something we can dip into there and learn from as we think about our own schemes of reflective practice. And I'm going to finish with a wee quote from Andrew Boyd. Self-reflection is the waiting room for change. The challenging though it is, self-reflection is the waiting room for change. What a lovely quote. Thank you, Andrew. Any final comments from you, Charlie, or indeed Barbara?
Hey, well, thanks to Barbara for sort of interrogating me in that way. And thanks to everybody for the comments, because actually, I mean, it's made me think that we're still quite early. I think we're still in the developmental stage, but I hope anyone else who's starting a mediation clinic will, find a way to build in reflective practice. That's my big hope, that it just becomes woven in to the way we do things. But thank you all for those contributions. Really interesting for me.
Thank you, Craig, for coming in and moderating the questions. That's great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm wondering if we should start calling our clients patients, whether they were more tolerant of being filmed. Anyway.
So thank you all. Charlie, Barbara, fascinating discussion, loads in the chat. And thank you, Craig, for moderating the questions. So that's absolutely perfect timing.